In 1920, women could at last matriculate, and you can see on those on that slide up there some of the first women to do so, and they could finally take their degrees as well. But women had studied in Oxford since the late 1870s, but no matter how well they did or how long they studied, how many subjects they mastered, they could not matriculate, and therefore they couldn't take their degrees before 1920. Now, in many ways, women's education, access to higher education, was limited across the UK in this period in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But Oxford was slower to shift than almost any other university. And Oxford and Cambridge collectively lag behind every other British university, all of which had opened their degrees to women by 1896. Now, it might be some consolation to know that Cambridge didn't follow until 1948, when women first took degrees. But 1920 was, in any case, very late by contemporary standards. To think of it in another way, it came even after women began to vote in parliamentary elections in 1918. So it seemed that securing the right to vote for women was easier than securing the right to matriculate in Oxford. The first women were finally awarded degrees in the Sheldonian on the 14th of October 1920. There was an occasion there that day, an atmosphere that was described by Vera Brittain as tense with the consciousness of a dream fulfilled. Today I'm going to speak about that dream, how it was fulfilled, and how even within the very tiny and exclusive club of late 19th century Oxford women's halls and societies, St Anne's stood out. I'll speak, of course, about provisions for women before 1920 and the campaign for women's equality within the university, because they are intrinsic to the history of this college and the university itself. But I also want to try to bring to life some of the people and some of the impulses that led to the formation of what would evolve into St Anne's College. Before I do that, I just want to say a few words about the development of St Anne's by way of terms and definitions. They're not straightforward, and you might notice that I'll be using several terms to describe the college over the period, and hopefully the reason for that will become clearer. This is just a very, very simple timeline, which doesn't pretend to explain anything more than some of the development of St Anne's. So that might help just to give it some context. So in 1878, as you can see on the slide, the Association for the Higher Education of Women, which was known as the AEW, was founded in Oxford. Its remit was, and I quote, to establish and maintain a system of instruction having general reference to the Oxford examination for women. And it served as a kind of umbrella body which oversaw the teaching of all women students, whether they were attached to a hall or whether they lived with their families or in private lodgings in the city. It had no official status in the university. It depended almost entirely on volunteers and on donations, and could not offer women a place in a college or even the chance of a degree when they completed their studies. In 1879, the following year, Somerville and LMH opened as halls of residence for women, 12 initial students in Somerville and 9 at LMH. But there are around 25 other women students, the majority, who could not or did not want to live in either of those halls. St Anne's dates its foundation to 1879, for it developed directly from the AEW's special responsibility for those unattached students. And the term unattached is a slightly tricky one. It's not one that was always appreciated at the time, but various terms were tried, and that was one that stuck. By 1888, the unattached students had adopted the title of home students, partly in recognition of their uniqueness and also at the urging of past and present students who sought a distinctive identity. So even, within a few years, these women who were unattached to any of the halls or had already got a sense of themselves as different and as a collective. They were formalised as the Society of Oxford Home Students in 1893, and this continued to oversee the women who lived with family or with what were called hostesses in Oxford. Mrs. Bertha Johnson, an AEW stalwart, was appointed principal, and as such is recognised as the first principal of St Anne's. We'll come back to her a bit later. In 1910, a delegacy for women students was formed, and importantly for St Anne's, a governing body for the home students followed quickly after. This Society of Home Students would in time become St Anne's College, but in those early years, it maintained a commitment to non-collegiate structure, where tutors could be sought from around the university, approached to teach women and paid separately for it, and women could live outside the halls and where resources could be shared by all of them. So as you can see, the history of St Anne's was not straightforward. The college website describes how the Society of Home Students was a manifesto rather than a location. And I think this is a great way, a brilliant way of understanding the evolution of the college from 1879 and the position of women in the university itself. In 1886, the warden of Merton College noted that the women's colleges were, and I quote, in Oxford, but they are not of Oxford. And this perception persisted into the 20th century. In 1927, several years after the right of women to matriculate and to take degrees had been won, the university imposed a quota on the total number of women students. They feared their overrepresentation in the university. So a quota of around 840, which was about 1/6 of the total undergraduate number, was imposed, and it survived with minor adjustments until 1957. Now, at the heart of this quota issue, and indeed the entire campaign for women's education rights in Oxford, was the question fundamentally of whether Oxford should be a men's university with a limited number of women in it, or a genuinely mixed sex institution. This question was finally resolved in the 20th century. But before then, I'm going to speak about this soon, women's education campaigners were compelled to lobby and to plan in a university which was very divided and very uncertain about their participation in it. Until 1920, women were seen as guests rather than members of the university or even as members of the family. The fact that decisions about women were almost always taken by university men underscored the marginal nature of the women in the university. As you'll know, the women's colleges remain distinct today. And I think this reflects a shared history and it also reflects the period in which they were formed. While St Anne's didn't have a permanent site until the 1930s, it's interesting that it too was established on similar architectural and domestic lines. The women's colleges resembled middle-class family homes where prayers, shared family meals and strict rules were compulsory. They largely abandoned staircases found in men's colleges. They opted instead for halls, which looked more like family homes and made the supervision of students much easier. They all preferred informal gardens and were all built outside the city centre. So while marking these women's societies out as different or in Oxford but not of it, as the warden said, these features also reassured early critics and the families of potential students that their daughters would be protected and kept as separate as possible in an environment like a home and away from male undergraduates. In common with the other men's colleges, the other women's colleges, St Anne's incorporated former family homes into the site. You can see them today. The repurposing of these often impressive houses was usually cheaper than building from scratch, but the houses themselves were symbolically and practically important, as they were often themselves products of institutional change, very, very significant institutional change and social change at the end, towards the end of the 19th century, which saw, for example, university fellows marrying in large numbers from the 1870s. Now, before this time, celibacy was required of almost all of them, and only a very few men were married while they had a post in Oxford, mainly some heads of houses, but celibacy was required. So the 1870 shift was a really big one. And as more and more dons married, the need for houses to accommodate their families grew rapidly, and North Oxford in particular expanded to meet this new constituency. It's not an accident that most of the women's colleges, including St Anne's of course, are situated around North Oxford. Sometimes in the late 19th century, some people referred to it as married Oxford. The Oxford movement for women's higher education developed out of some of these familial networks and was largely spearheaded by progressive university men and their wives, daughters, sisters, and other relatives. As it didn't require residency in a central building, the Society of Home Students was particularly attractive to the daughters of these liberal Oxford academic families, many of whom, of course, lived in North Oxford, so didn't need their daughters to board. And many of St Anne's most illustrious early members were relatives of these male academics, and a number of them made a significant and lasting impact on the development of the college and the university. We'll meet some of them a bit later. Well, how were these pioneering women taught? And if women couldn't take degrees before 1920, what did they actually do in Oxford? Well, they were here primarily to study, which is, of course, what we still tell our undergraduates today. And they were here to obtain the very best that Oxford could offer them in terms of teaching and education. The AEW made most of the arrangements for home students and for women in halls. They organised lectures. They paid for those lectures separately, which brought in a useful income for some male dons. They organised, for example, chaperones as well for women who were going to mixed lectures. And chaperones became a feature of Oxford life in the late 19th century. They were required even for large groups of women in the very early days for social and academic occasions. And from 1893 for mixed, and from after 1893 for these mixed lectures. This custom was more or less dispensed with before the First World War, but versions of it existed into the 20s and possibly beyond. The chaperones themselves were often figures of fun. Some of them were from the AEW, some of them from the halls, or what were described ambiguously as North Oxford ladies. And they're often depicted with their knitting to while away the time while the women were lectured. The AEW organised some of its own lectures and eventually acquired 2 lecture rooms in the Clarendon building for this purpose. But in its earlier days, it used rented rooms over a bakery in Little Clarendon Street, which I'm sure you've all walked past many times, although it's no longer a bakery, it's now a furniture shop. The original building was destroyed. And they also rented rooms in a Baptist chapel, which is tucked away off St Giles. Sadly, I haven't been able to find pictures of these buildings, and as I said, the bakery's being knocked down, although it was said that many women associated the smell of bread with writing for hours in lectures over the bakery. The fact that the bakery's gone and I couldn't find pictures really underlines the fragility of the early movement. It was a fragility that makes tracing the history of the college particularly tricky as it moved. I like to think of it as a movable feast. The AEW had its own office and library too, which was tucked away in the attics, also in the Clarendon building. This is a picture, this is a sketch by an undergraduate from the late 19th century. And you can see just about, it's in Univ. You can see the women who are seated at a separate table in this lecture. Their chaperones are there with their hats, and rather strangely, this undergraduate is seated very close to them. I think that must have been wishful thinking on his behalf because they were strictly segregated. Now, this is the library, and as you can see from the picture, the office and the library were one and the same, and they were pretty cosy. The librarian described in 1900 how even the most irreproachable student might feel her heart sink as she climbed the dark, laborious staircase to the library. But she added too that the AEW office is not merely an office. It is a spacious, cheerful, book-lined room, which even those who enter it only to pay their fees can hardly fail to appreciate. And many of you, I'm sure, will have had tutorials or have offices that look very much like that. As women became more obviously part of the university and proved their seriousness as scholars, they began to go increasingly to the mixed lectures that I mentioned earlier. And by 1897, Magdalen was the only college that refused to admit women to lectures. The lectures were very valuable for women, and many remember enjoying them, being stimulated by them, and also being taken seriously by their tutors. The women students worked as hard as the men, more so according to many of them because they had so many extra hurdles to jump. But their position remained anomalous in the university. The AEW students were required to work towards exams, and most examinations were gradually opened to women. Special exams were held for them, but they sat the same papers as men, and no matter what grade they achieved, they could not take a degree. The absurdity of this situation was not lost at the women at the heart of the campaign, and we're very fortunate that Annie Rogers, who's here on your slide, had kept records of this, which really tell us about the twists and turns before 1920. She was an extraordinary woman, the first Oxford Don, one of the best known education campaigners of her day. She'd grown up in a liberal Oxford family. She was absolutely of Oxford. She was one of the children who was photographed by Lewis Carroll, for example. She was said to know everybody in the university and seemed to know all the latest news. And as Janet Howarth notes, Annie Rogers once listed her recreations as bicycling and attending committees. And her talent for administration were invaluable to the movement. And she might be interested to know that this is pretty much what many of us still do today. Well, women's education in Oxford was a personal issue for her as well as a matter of justice. As a schoolgirl, she sat the Oxford school examinations, which were open to girls, but only ever taken by boys. Balliol and Worcester had offered exhibitions or scholarships on the basis of those exams, clearly never contemplating that a woman might top the senior locals, as they were called. But in 1873, Annie Rogers did, having topped the junior locals a couple of years before. She remembered that this created some little storm, but it was really the first shot in a much longer battle to open the university to women. Balliol presented her not with an exhibition, but with a gift of books in recognition of her achievement in those local exams. And Annie Rogers herself noted rather archly that the exhibition, the scholarship, was eventually awarded to a boy who was 6th on the list. And you can only imagine how galling that must have been for her. She was a vital person in the history of St Anne's. She was a tutor in classics for the home students, secretary to the committees which oversaw the home students. From 1893 to 1936, apart from a gap of 1 year, she was absolutely the heart of the business of higher education for women. Now, Annie Rogers recognised the position in Oxford as absurd and described a situation where women could take the degree examinations of the university and were required to pay fees for them. But at the same time, the university made no regulations about what or where they were taken, how the women were taught, and where they lived. They would also not allow them to take a degree in recognition of their work for these examinations, as I've said. This sort of hands-off approach from the university allowed the AEW some freedom to develop in interesting ways. And some women preferred a more flexible approach to exams. Women came up to Oxford to study for various periods, sometimes for a term, sometimes for several years. They would study a particular subject, and sometimes they then went on to take their degrees at other universities. This is what happened to Emily Wilding Davidson, who studied for a term in St Hugh's, but ended up taking her degree in London. But despite this flexibility, which some women found useful, Annie Rogers said that the lack of oversight and uniformity meant that it was said that no one knew what an Oxford woman had actually done. And this remained the case until 1920. Janet Howarth, who was a history tutor at St Hilda's and is the most prominent historian of the movement and the period, she very insightfully described the liminal place of women in the university, guests in Oxford but not of Oxford. But despite this, students themselves built their own traditions and customs. Unlike the women's halls, the women students did not share accommodation, and they developed a collective identity in stages. From 1899, they had a common room in the High Street, which was in this building. And they used that common room to rest between lectures and also to rest their bicycles. Looking at this picture and thinking about how they were provided with this room kind of reminds us that unlike male undergraduates, they had nowhere to go between lectures. They couldn't go anywhere and have a cup of tea, really. It was more difficult for women to just pop in somewhere. They couldn't go back to their rooms or their common rooms unless they had a large gap between lectures. So this room was found for them. Unfortunately, no trace of it exists. But for a college that finally found its home in North Oxford, St Anne's forebears, as you can see, enjoyed periods in a number of city centre accommodations. Again, we have, I like to think of it as a movable feast. The home students had their own clubs and joined university women's clubs as well. They played tennis and hockey. Drama and debating were popular, and a boat club emerged in 1908. That's an earlier picture of them on the river. In 1910, they acquired their own space in Ship Street, and this was funded privately, almost entirely, it seems, by Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, and by friends and old students who donated various bits of furniture, teacups, and so on. They also published The Ship from this office from 1911, and of course this was named after their Ship Street home, and finding that out solved a mystery to me. I've wondered for years why it was called The Ship, and now we know. In 1913, they adopted a crest, which was the beaver, and it's appeared in various versions over the years. You can see from these book plates how they encompass some of these early ideas. So you can see that both of these book plates have the ship in them, and the one on the right also has a beaver scuttling along close to the bottom. It's very different from the beaver that's associated with the college today, which is much bigger and has a much more garish face. Many of these women who came to the colleges and came to St Anne's were interested also in political issues, and inevitably, many of them at least, were active in the Oxford Women's Suffrage Society and the Oxford Women's Students' Society for Women's Suffrage, and that was the banner of the Women's Society, which was paid for by women from all the women's colleges and Home Society students as well, who are also members of the society. Suffragists with links to the Society of Home Students included Annie Rogers, whom we've met, Ruth and Violet Butler, who were home students, and in the case of Ruth, tutor, college historian and vice principal from 1919. Grace Haddo, the college's third principal, should also be recognised. As a young woman, she'd served as president of the Oxford Women's Suffrage Society and had helped to carry what she described as its heavy, magnificent banner during the Women's Pilgrimage, which passed through Oxford on its way to London in 1913. And that's the banner. Sadly, none of these banners survive. We have some pictures, and this one we had recreated from a sketch in a newspaper. We had it recreated for the centenary of women's suffrage in 1918. But it was said also to have some tassels, and of course, it had very large poles for carrying as well, which were heavy. Now, despite these various developments and the genuine enjoyment that women found in their studies and in their Oxford lives, there remained the issue of degrees and women's status within the university. Annie Rogers bluntly explained that there was plainly strong prejudice against allowing women to be educated in Oxford, and she recalled one male don exclaiming that women's admission would spell, and I quote, "the loss of the virility of the university and the danger to proctorial discipline." And I'll come back to that. I think virility is a very interesting term. This is another sketch from the late 19th century, and it's a sketch depicting what might happen if women were admitted, and if they were admitted as equals and allowed to partake of all the usual customs and things in Oxford. And you can see that in the middle there's the Sheldonian Theatre, and the women have taken over the undergraduates gallery, and all round that Sheldonian you can see women portrayed as doing things that only men did in Oxford. So we've got a woman punching someone in a town gown row. We've got one rowing, we've got one competing in athletics. Another one there is smoking and carousing, wearing her mortarboard. Sitting in examination, orating at the Union, and even patrolling the high street as proctors. This was almost unthinkable. Well, why was there so much suspicion and opposition to women in Oxford, especially when we think that they were being admitted to most other universities? Well, there was a range of reasons. Many critics wondered why women needed university education at all, as their highest aspiration should be marriage, while others doubted their intellectual and physiological capacity for it. And still others thought that women would be overwhelmed and unsexed, as they said, by university life, especially if they were permitted to mix with men. And shockingly, they might even compete with men, overtake them, and eventually ignore them. And many of these arguments were used in the suffrage campaign as well, about women's incapacity, intellectual and physical incapacity for Parliament, and in this case for the university. And there were many cartoons at the time which depicted this. This is one from Punch in the late 19th century. And you can see that some very, very attractive young women are walking down the stairs with elderly gentlemen, while the poor men are lonely and just looking on against the wall. And you probably can't read it there, but what it says underneath is, Miss Jones, spinster of arts, on her way to refreshment, informs Professor Parallax that young men do very well to look at or to dance with and all that kind of thing. But as to enjoying any rational conversation with any man under 50, that is completely out of the question. And that, I think, sort of goes back to that, the idea of virility, the idea of disturbing the kind of natural order of not only university life, but middle-class life in general. And overarching all of this, I think, was this fear that the arrival of women in an entirely male and largely celibate community of men would lead to male undergraduates being, as it was described, distracted and ruining their prospects of good careers. So it's important to remember that although Oxford's first women lived a life there, enjoyed freedom there of thought and of action that many of their friends and other contemporaries would have envied, they also continued to face these restrictions which marked them out as different. And they also continue to face ridicule, as you've seen from some of these cartoons. And yet they continued to come, and they continued to insist that the privilege of studying in Oxford was not in itself enough. Degrees mattered to the women who studied here in those years. They mattered because they would confer a formal recognition of their hard work at Oxford, a recognition also increasingly preferred by employees. And that goes back to that quote from Annie Rogers, who said, nobody really knows what a woman's done in Oxford. They mattered because the lack of degrees represented women's inferior status, not only as students, but also within the intellectual and official life of the university itself. Without degrees, they could not wear their gowns as authentic students and tutors were expected to, and they could not list BA, MA, and so on after their names. This mattered so much that some Oxford women even travelled to Trinity College and the University of Dublin between 1904 and 1907, and you can see them there. They were awarded degrees there they were awarded their degrees, which their own universities, for which they were qualified and which their own universities refused to give them. There was a loophole which allowed this for 4 years. Trinity was one of the very last universities to open its doors to women in 1904. About 700 women from England and Scotland took this opportunity. At least 100 of them were from Oxford. You can see them all there. This was an exhausting and expensive option for many of them, and they became known as the steamboat ladies because they would travel to Dublin for one night only, crossing on the mail boat, which left from Holyhead. They had to pay fees for their matriculation and for their degrees, had to hire academic gowns and caps for the ceremony, and a basic package, which included all the travel and the fees and accommodation and so on, was said to have come to about £27, which was quite a lot of money in that period. But having been awarded their degrees from the University of Dublin, some Oxbridge women were finally permitted to wear gowns and to list their qualifications, and they did so proudly. The status of women graduates was important for employment prospects, as I've said, but it was also important, and it was also important for self-esteem. But it also reflected the status of women graduates beyond Oxbridge, and especially in the suffrage movement. Women who attended large suffrage processions were encouraged to wear what were described as their academicals, more than encouraged, they were urged to. And in this slide, you can see this is a contingent from the Women's Freedom League, and they're all marching, wearing their gowns. This is very, very common if you have a look at a lot of suffrage photographs from their meetings and from their processions and so on. You'll see lots of women wearing their academic gowns. And this one, in this slide, the women are carrying banners of their respective universities in which they'd been awarded degrees. And of course, Oxford women couldn't do that. Instead, they marched under, sometimes they marched with their own colleges, and most of the colleges had their own suffrage banners, or they marched with the Oxford Women's Suffrage Society or the Oxford Women's Student Suffrage Society, and many of them felt a great loss at not being able to march as graduates of their own university. Now, the aim of having women wear these gowns to these marches was to present them as respectable, intellectually and qualified women who were nonetheless denied the vote. And the woman graduate, as I've said, started to appear in quite a lot of suffrage propaganda. And this is one, it's not very subtle. As you can see, the woman graduate was contrasted with the men who did not have the right to vote, to highlight the absurdity of the exclusion of these respectable and educated women. Now, you might have noticed, going back in this Trinity picture and also here, that the women tended to wear gowns and mortarboards. Oxford instead came to adopt the soft cap, which many of you have worn, for students, and subfusk as well for students and senior women. It looked to many commentators like the costume of a schoolgirl. White blouse, dark coat and skirt, black stockings and boots, black shoes or boots, and a black tie. And of course, this exists, although anyone who walks through Oxford today will see that it's been modified significantly. The women's principals recommended this, having talked amongst themselves and having organised a parade of options and sending samples to the women's colleges for their consultation. Annie Rogers approved particularly of the cap, and she said, "The soft cap is becoming and can be adjusted to varieties of coiffure. It does not catch the wind and it does not get shabby." Now, one of the commentators who was less than happy in some ways about this new dress code was Mrs. Johnson, the principal of the home students. You can see her there in the middle. She was the first of the five women's principals to be awarded the MA on the 14th of October 1920. In fact, the first woman to be awarded a degree in the long, long history of the university. She's there in the middle, as I said, holding a walking stick. And as you can see, she wore black. She wore a black blouse on the day, allegedly telling the Vice-Chancellor that she had never before worn a white blouse and didn't mean to begin to unless she was strictly required to. So evidently she got her own way. And that's something you do not see very often. The other women, of course, women principals are all dressed correctly. But I'm jumping the gun a bit here. What the women wore that day was, of course, very minor in the grand scheme of things. The university had published at the end of 1919 proposed new statute pertaining to women's formal admission. This helpfully coincided with the Sex Disqualification Act, which was designed to abolish women's remaining disabilities in a range of areas. When the women's statute, as it came to be known, was debated in congregation in early 1920, there was very little opposition, and two amendments designed to exclude women from faculty boards and from becoming examiners were defeated as well. The statute came into force on the 7th of October when 129 women were matriculated. Many more wished that they could be so as well. And at last, having studied for many years. But they had to be matriculated first, and in 1920 and 1921, 1,159 women were matriculated over a series of ceremonies. Extra ceremonies had to be laid on because there was such a demand. Given this long and winding history of women's education in Oxford, Being awarded a degree was not always straightforward. Very distinguished women sometimes found that they had not met all the requirements. And some of them were compelled to take undergraduate examinations over the next few years before they could qualify, allegedly wearing the commoner's gown, which must have been very mortifying. These were often very senior academics and tutors within the women's colleges. Annie Rogers described the proceedings in the Sheldonian as impressive and dignified. This was a culmination of her life's work and a vindication of her many efforts. The women's statute, had been very, very hard won. But she also remained acutely aware of the differences that remained despite this remarkable concession. She noticed, for example, that the custom of admitting all the male candidates to degrees before any of the women was introduced in 1920, and it lasted for many years. She noted too, rather archly, that women must have contributed around £20,000 to the university coffers in those first 2 years, 20 and 21. And she said the generosity of the university in admitting women to privileges was well rewarded by the women it had so long refused to recognise as its legitimate daughters. Well, Oxford has, of course, changed immeasurably since these pioneers made their marks, but their presence can still be felt, and especially when we look for it through buildings and so on, and sites which no longer exist. But it can still be felt today around the university, and it can still be found around St Anne's as well. One can find a plaque dedicated to Grace Haddo in the University Church, and there's also a memorial to Annie Rogers in there and a bench for her as well. And I'm really delighted that Annie Rogers will soon also be honoured with a blue plaque just in the next couple of months, and that will be put on one of her old home in St Giles, not too far from St Anne's, which seems fitting. Within the college itself is the Nettleship Library, which was donated in 1895 by the widow of Henry Nettleship, who'd helped to set up the AEW and served as Latin tutor for the women students for many years. Like the college, over the years, the library has expanded and migrated, eventually to be incorporated into the St Hugh's College Library. To this day, one of the largest in the university, and the women's libraries were very well stocked. The college's Geldart collection of mainly legal texts was similarly donated by a supporter of women's educational and citizenship rights. William Geldart, Professor of Law, was Vice President of the Oxford Women's Suffrage Society, while his wife was its president, its secretary. He became chairman of the governing body of the Home Students and played a leading part as a lawyer in the Women's Statute of 1920. Their commitment to the college can be seen in our own day in the Geldart Society, which is the College Law Society, the Geldart Room, which houses the law books in the college library. There are many other traces of these remarkable people around the college. We'll be tracing some of those and discovering some of those and discussing some of those in our new project. If we look, for example, at number 32, Banbury Road, this was the house of Florence Quick. She was one of the first city councillors in Oxford, devoted supporter of women's rights, and a home student herself. She remained a treasurer of the Old Student Society of the college for more than 30 years. A very little formal trace remains of her life and her history. She was very difficult to track down, despite the fact that she did lead a remarkable life. So I'm delighted that her home is attached to the college that she loved dearly, and can continue to remind us of her very great life. The Rees family, perhaps more than any other, has become embedded in St Anne's, as their family home at 35 Banbury Road now forms also part of the college site. Their ties with the college were very strong and deep. The Rees sisters, Mavamwi and Olwen, and you can see Olwen sitting on the first in the left, in the back row. They played key roles in all the Oxford societies, as did their parents. Their father, Professor John Rees, was principal of Jesus College and a leading supporter of women's education and suffrage. The Rees family hosted many meetings which championed women's causes, including the meeting in 1878 at which the AEW was formed. Mavamwi and Olwen became life members of the Oxford Home Students. Movanwy was the first president of the Oxford Women's Suffrage Society, and she was one of the steamboat ladies. She travelled in 1905. Olwen was a home student who earned first-class mark in the university's women's exams in modern languages. She finally received her MA in 1924, being one of the women obliged to sit a new series of examinations, as the university would not recognise the women's examinations she'd taken in 1901. Nonetheless, she became the first home student to be appointed a university examiner in 1925 and became Society of Home Students lecturer in French in 1929. And she remained in this post until 1946, an absolute stalwart of the college. The Rees family and their former home represent a fusion of a number of forces which shaped the women's education campaign in Oxford and particularly in St Anne's. University supporters, tutors and women students, reformers often meeting in private homes, and slowly but surely building a case for women's equal treatment in the university. Of course, we can't know what these former residents would make of modern Oxford, but the absorption of their homes into the fabric of the modern college would surely please them, I think, as it reflects St Anne's place in a number of progressive movements and in the life of the expanding city and the university at the turn of the 20th century. Thank you. So, I believe we are now moving to Q&A. And if you want to send any pictures, if you want to send any questions, please do, and I'll try my very best to answer them. I'm just looking here. Okay, so there's a question from somebody asking, was there a period of time during the 20th century? Sorry, I can't make that out, it's a bit fuzzy. Okay, Stella Sharman has asked, can you say a bit more about how the Great War and perhaps the flu pandemic that followed might have helped to shift entrenched male attitudes to women in Oxford? It's a really great question, and there's been quite a lot of interesting work done on women during the First World War in Oxford. And anyone who's read Vera Brittain will get a really strong sense of what university life must have been like for women. And Oxford apparently was a very different place. Many undergraduates and dons left, and for a time women outnumbered men in the university. Now, all the women students worked, well, as far as we know, certainly the colleges and the halls and the societies devoted themselves to various forms of war work. Some colleges shifted altogether. Some of them moved to Oriel for the duration because its grounds were used for medical reasons. And as far as we can see, many of the women threw themselves into all sorts of activities around organising comforts and so on for soldiers, helping with Belgian refugees and so on. Now, whether or not that shifted male attitudes to Oxford is a really interesting question. It's a question that's often asked as well about whether the war shifted ideas about women in terms of the vote as well. And I think the answer is probably yes and no. The move for degrees was on the cards before the First World War, just as the votes for women were. So I think perhaps the war helped I think the war broke down various barriers and men and women mixed more easily, and women did very different things from what they'd done before, and they were admired for it. So I think, as I say, I think it's a bit of yes and a bit of no. I think the shift had really happened before the First World War, thanks to the hard work of some of the people that I've been speaking about today. Okay, I've got another question. Why was Oxford so slow compared to other universities? That's from Lauren. That's a great question, and it's one that I've been thinking about an awful lot, and it's something that I'm hoping that we'll know a lot more about once we get our new resource up and running, which is going to have a lot of the early records of the women's colleges there collectively, so we can look at them all. There are a number of reasons for it. the most preeminent historian of this is Janet Howarth, as I said before, and she talks about various reasons around religious attitudes, and around various kinds of entrenched ideas which were found in Oxford. I think it's a combination of things. I think, but I think to say that it was just more conservative is not enough. Oxford and Cambridge were ancient universities, and they were very complex, and they had what we might today call many stakeholders: colleges, university itself, churches, and so on, or religious interests, and so on. So undoing all of that, I think, was a huge task, and getting everybody to agree finally took an awful lot of work. And so I think that's part of the problem, just the fact of the way that Oxford was. I think also that, Oxford was, as I said, a celibate, entirely male community. It was imbued with male sociability. It was imbued with religious ideas. The very architecture of the place was designed for men. So it's, when you're in the 19th century, many new universities were established, and it's very different to start from the beginning with new rules that suit modern society than it is to reform something that's quite so ancient. And as any historian will tell you, change is sometimes very slow. I think that's part of the reason. Okay, just looking here. Okay. One from Helen King. Helen's asking, the way women were treated seems outrageous. I agree. To what extent were they angry? I think in Cambridge there were protests and damage, or did they have the huge depths of patience and diplomacy? This is one of the great challenges of being a historian. So I work a lot on the women's suffrage movement as well. And of course, when one reads the things that they release to the public, in letters and pamphlets and so on, they all sound very dignified. They all seem really rational. It's the same for the Oxford movement. But I can't imagine that secretly, particularly someone like Annie Rogers, whose book, Degrees by Degrees, which is fantastic, it's full of really arch and sarcastic comments. I think for someone like her, seeing a boy who finished sixth in the list getting a scholarship over her must have been really galling. And I think if you read, the other person who's very good on this is Vera Britton. I mean, she's very openly furious about the way that women were treated in Oxford. I mean, different women would have expressed this in different ways, and there were very different views about what should be done. This is the other thing I probably didn't say enough in the talk, that even within this community of people who supported women's education in Oxford, there were differences in what they thought that education should look like. I mean, some wanted the colleges to develop and to become the equivalents of the male colleges. Some wanted them to always be separate. They thought, Mrs. Johnson thought, for example, that women, that setting up women's colleges was well and good, but actually women should just be taking advantage. It was much more useful to take advantage of the male tutors than building up entire new institutions. So there's quite a lot of disagreement in there. But I'm with you, Helen. I think there was undoubtedly a good deal of serious anger in the background. Right. Right. Sorry, I'm just trying to read these questions, and this is all very new still for all of us here. It would be great if I was in a room with you all. Much easier to sort of look at people and discuss things, but here we are. So Richard Hussey's asked, can you talk more about the sources available and the challenge you touched on in finding some important figures or places that aren't documented in official archives at least? It's a really good question, and it gives me the excuse I want to talk about our new project, which is called Women in Oxford, 1878 to 1920, Education and Activism. And it's a website, it's going to be a website resource, which, as I said, we're working with all the women's colleges on. And what we're going to be able to do there is to and of course this has all begun now, we're going to be able to digitize all the early records so that they can all be in one place, which is going to make finding out about women's experiences in Oxford in this early period much easier. We'll be able to compare, because the colleges kept, for example, their own registers. Women students are not registered in the Central University until 1920. And there'll be also all the reports of the AW, the home students and so on, and all the other reports and so on, and committee minutes and so on that really allow us to build up a picture. So having them all together is going to be fantastic. And it's the sort of resource that would have made, say, writing this paper 1,000 times easier. The challenges are that those sources that I've just talked about have been scattered, as I've said, throughout the women's archives, and now they're being put together. That's going to help. So someone like, Deborah Quick, Florence Quick, whom I mentioned, is a really interesting sort of example of someone who's kind of slipped through the net. I came across her quite accidentally, and I thought, because I was really interested in who owned the houses around the St Anne's site, and I read an obituary and I thought, well, everybody must know this woman. She was one of the first. She was a Liberal. She was a poor law guardian. As I said, she was one of the first women to be a city councillor in Oxford. She had an OBE for her work. I couldn't find anything. She's not in the DMB. She's not, as far as I could see, I just could not find her. Luckily, the very wonderful Claire White, librarian at St Anne's, found some more information about her, including an obituary in the Ship. And that starts to sort of shed light on her. But when I found her, I thought, it made me think, how many other women are out there who did incredible things that we don't know about? So I think we all feel, I think, in this project that we want to try to make available some of the history of these women so that we can start piecing together not only the histories of the colleges, but also a broader history of the university. And one of the things that we'll be doing, which I'd be thrilled if you were, if you're all, or some of you at least would be interested in, is we're writing a walking app of Oxford, and we're going to try a women's walking app of Oxford, which is going to talk about the women's colleges and about suffrage and so on. And that will try to bring to life some of these women. So fingers crossed that should be up in the next few months. Are there any? Sorry, I'm afraid. Okay, so in the early days, 1920s to 30s, do you have any detail as to what the women went on to do once they were able to obtain degrees? Did they pursue careers? And if so, what type of careers? Again, that's a really interesting question. And hopefully, once we have our collective archive up and running, we'll be able to track that sort of thing much more easily. One of the places that you can track that is through the college journals, the college magazines, and also the Fritillary in the early days, which was a lovely journal which was produced by all the women students from the halls and the home students as well, where they list who was coming up and often what had happened to them. And often it would also publish letters from women who had left Oxford and wanted to sort of keep in touch with, or let other people in Oxford know what they're up to. So the most sort of comprehensive work I've done on this, or I've seen on this, suggests that in the early years in particular, that teaching was a very popular career for women who studied at Oxford. English literature and languages and history were the two of the most popular subjects as well. So teaching was very popular. One of the things it's in some ways, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because obviously careers were not as open to women in that period. So we can only really know what they went on to do, not really what they wanted to do, perhaps. So governesses as well come up. Occasionally, the other category that I find really interesting and I'd like to know more about is the number of women who were trained by Oxford to become academics themselves. And some of those, of course, like Olwen Rees and Annie Rogers, remained in Oxford. And there were many women who did stay in Oxford and ended up being tutors here, but many others as well who went to other degrees, who went to other universities and became very distinguished academics. Some women married, and some women stopped working when they were married. Some women didn't. Mrs. Johnson herself was married with 2 sons while she was, running the AEW and principal of the home students. Have you found any surprises in the St Anne's archive? Well, mainly because of COVID, I haven't been able to go into the archive, which is really disappointing. But I've been really lucky to have Claire providing me with all sorts of things. I mean, I suppose, strangely enough, the book plates I found really fascinating, particularly the one with the ship and the badge and the beaver on it. I was surprised to hear about the beaver. I didn't realise it was a big part of St Anne's, and apparently Claire tells me that it was in the earliest days, and then it kind of disappears. My husband was at St Anne's in the late 80s, and he tells me he doesn't remember any kind of sign of a beaver, but now it seems to be everywhere, and you can find it in the university shop and so on. So it's interesting how, as a historian, I found it really interesting how this tradition kind of was produced and then disappeared for a while and then came back. And there are all sorts of other traditions like that seem to have disappeared. Annie Rogers is really great on this. She uses a lot of, she in inverted commas, of course, she describes some of the slang that was used at the time. For example, the taking a degree in divinity, or some of the courses in that were called divas, which I like a lot. And some of the women tutors, as Janet Howarth has said, had all sorts of interesting nicknames. But very much looking forward to getting back in there. I've spent time in various of the women's colleges archives, and they are full of fascinating stuff. Probably my favourite thing that I found was actually an LMH, and it was a record, I did not know this existed, of the funding of how the banner for the Oxford Women's Suffrage Society was actually paid for. And what we see in those records are handwritten notes of, Miss so-and-so gave a guinea, Miss so-and-so gave £1, and all the women's colleges and the home students all contributed to that banner. And there's a lot of detail there about what it cost and all the rest of it. So that was fascinating, because you really get to see the sort of inside of the creation of something like that. And it was from that we could recreate the banner as well, which was wonderful. Hilary Baxter asks, what percentage of professors are women today in Oxford? Unbelievably for me, because this is something that preoccupies me, I can't tell you the exact answer right now, but it's the answer is not enough. The percentage is very low, and it is growing, and the university is putting more resources into that, but it is still very low. It is lower than many other universities, but there are other universities that have a worse percentage. So it's difficult to know whether to attribute that to a particularly Oxford thing. I think I've been teaching here for 20 years, and I think, as I said before, that, and many people will tell you in Oxford, particularly anyone who's had to do with anything to do with anyone who's been involved in changing things, that changing anything in Oxford is really difficult, and it can take, especially, as I said, when all these stakeholders are involved, it's a collegiate university, can take an awfully long time. And that's one of the problems in the institution, but I think it is changing, and I really hope, especially during this centenary year, that we put a lot more time into making sure that those changes really start happening at a pace. Okay, well, thank you all very much. I'm sorry I couldn't ask all the questions. I have to admit, answer all the questions. I have to admit that one or two of them I just don't know the answers to. But I hope that you all look at the archive when it's ready. You'll be able to follow it on St Anne's, which will have all sorts of updates, and also hopefully you will do the walking app. But thank you very much for joining me today, and goodbye again from a still sunny Oxford.
Thank you so much, Senia. And just to to pop in to say thank you so much for giving your time. That was a really fascinating talk. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who joined this morning as well. Thank you.